After I graduated from college, I started working at a law firm. But it was only after I had accepted the job that I noticed that all of my coworkers were men. They were all decent men, so it didn't bother me much. After a few months of working there, I became very close to one of my coworkers. His name was Jaden. And let me just say, we ended up getting married a year later. Of course, when we were seeing each other, we didn't let the others at the firm know, and especially not our boss, who had strictly prohibited dating at the working place. As the relationship progressed, Jaden told me to quit my job and marry him. Jaden lived with his parents in the city, not too far from our workplace. He still hadn't paid off his college debt and planned to stay with his parents until he could pay it all off. So when we got married, I ended up having to move into his parents' house. A couple of months after we moved in, I found out I was expecting a baby, our first child. Both me and my husband were happier than ever, but at the same time, we knew we weren't in an ideal situation at the moment. Since I had left my job, Jaden had to work overtime. But even after that, we found ourselves struggling to fit our necessities into the budget. Above all of that, living with his parents was difficult and often ended up being stressful. Both me and my husband wanted to get a place of our own. Although my husband's debt wasn't fully paid off at that time, he still insisted that it was time we moved, especially before the baby arrived. My husband began to work 2 jobs at this point, and sometimes he wouldn't come back home until it was past midnight. It made me feel sad and lonely, and I kept on wondering if there was something I could do to ease our financial situation. Unfortunately, we weren't able to arrange enough money to get a place of our own before our son was born. After we had our son, I spent most of the time taking care of him, or simply just playing with him or sitting next to him and admiring him. Jaden's parents were also very fond of the grandchild, and once he started to talk and walk, they often took him out to the arcade or amusement park. It wasn't long before our son was 4 years old, but my husband and I were still stuck in the same situation. I began looking for a job that I could do from home, so I wouldn't have to give up my child to daycare. It was one of these days that Jaden came home with good news. He told me that he had received a promotion and that we would finally be able to afford renting an apartment. I was happy, but along with the good news, I also realized he would be even more busy with work now. We rarely got any time to be together. Within the end of that year, we were able to rent a nice apartment in a decent neighborhood. My husband would leave the house early in the morning. While he was at work, I ran the household and raised our son. He was old enough to start attending school. While he would be there, I had half the day all to myself. I cooked and cleaned and finished up all the usual chores that needed to be done in the house, and then I would pick up our son from school. Each of the floors in our building had 4 apartments, and the doors faced each other. Since I had so much free time, I decided to try to get to know the neighbors. Perhaps I'd be able to make a friend or two. I walked up to the first door straight across from our door. I planned to introduce myself and tell them that we had just moved in next door, but just as I raised my hand, the door suddenly opened and a gray-haired man peered through the gap. He looked at me suspiciously. "Hello, I'm Maria. I'm new." Without even letting me finish, the man hissed and said, "Get out of here. What do you think you're doing? Nobody has the time to be friends and chit-chat with you. Stay in your apartment and leave us all alone on this floor." I was taken aback at the man's behavior. I teared up a little bit and began to stammer. I didn't know what to say. Go away. Lock yourself in your apartment and go have a cup of tea. Leave everybody alone. Nobody wants to talk to you here. Get out. And if you don't, I'll call the police." The man shouted his last words and banged the door shut on my face. I felt so humiliated. I couldn't help but cry. I wiped my tears as I muttered under my breath, "I hope I get to attend a funeral soon." I turned around to go back to our apartment when I heard someone calling me. It was a female voice and she spoke softly. "Psst. Girl, I'm sorry you had to experience that." I looked and saw a young woman peeping out the door of her apartment on the other corner of the corridor. She smiled at me and said, "You must be our new neighbor. Welcome." I felt a little better after seeing there was some kind people here. I cleared up my clogged voice and said, "Yes, I moved here a few days ago." "I heard what that crazy old man said to you. Don't let it get you down. That's just how he is. Would you like to come in for a cup of tea and maybe some cookies? I've just took some out of the oven." I gratefully accepted her invitation and went to her apartment. It wasn't long before we became good friends. Her name was Francesca, and she told me she was divorced. Her husband had left her many years back. She was now a single mother to their son. Her son was nearly the same age as mine, and we ended up visiting each other's apartment quite often. We would gossip and get caught up to the latest news in town while our children played together. Once we became a little closer, Francesca started telling me about her husband. Francesca didn't have a job, and her husband didn't support her either. Her own family would send her money time to time, and she would have to run on that. Francesca wouldn't go out much. She didn't send her son to school either. She homeschooled him. One day, my son fell sick, and I decided to give him a day off from school. He had a high fever, and I didn't have any medicine at home. I didn't want to take him out, so I asked Francesca to look after him for an hour or two so I could get some groceries and pick up some medicine from the pharmacy on my way back. Francesca was more than happy to help out. She picked up my son in her arms and rubbed his back. "Don't worry, little fella, you'll be better in no time." I headed out and finished up my errands as fast as I could and returned to the apartment. I walked up the stairs and left all the bags at my apartment before bringing back my son. But when I knocked on Francesca's door, there was no response. I called out her name, but it seemed like no one was home. Numerous thoughts were running through my mind. Did something happen? Why did they leave? Where did they go? I didn't know what to do. Hesitantly, I walked over to the old man's apartment and pounded on the door. He didn't open the door, but I could hear him standing right on the other side. I kept knocking until he opened the door just a crack and hissed out again. "Didn't I tell you to get out of here?" I explained to him that I was only searching for my son. I had left him with the neighbors and was wondering whether he had seen Francesca leaving the apartment with him. I was stuttering on my own words as I spoke, and the old man looked at me and began shaking his head. He changed his tone and said, "You stupid girl," and opened the door and gestured me to come inside. When I got inside, he told me to close the door. When I closed it, I saw a shelf on the top portion of the door, and on it was a box of pins and needles. I thought it was a very strange place to keep pins, but I was in no mind to think of anything other than my son. The old man ushered me to follow him. I saw that his apartment was rather neat and clean. There was nothing out of place or unorganized. The old man took me to the living room and told me to sit. I noticed along the wall to the side, all the furniture were placed a distance away from the wall, and a long line of some white powder was spread across the floor along the wall. I looked at it carefully and realized it was salt. I asked the man, "Do you know where my son is?" He looked sad and replied in the affirmative. "I'm afraid I do." The man's attitude was making my head go hot. I demanded to know where my son was. When the man saw me getting angry, he cleared his voice and spoke loudly. "What do you think of yourself? Didn't I warn you to leave everyone alone and stay in your apartment? There's a reason I told you to stay away. You young people never listen when we give you advice, always dismissing it as hocus pocus. Trust me, if you knew what I did, you would have never stepped out of your house." I interrupted the man. I couldn't understand anything he was saying. The truth is that we don't live next door to any ordinary girl. Every night I hear high-pitched screeching noises from behind that wall. The man stopped and pointed at the wall that was bordered with salt. I couldn't understand if he was serious. "The same Francesca you're talking about used to live next door 3 years ago," the man continued. I paused him and asked, "What do you mean, used to live?" "You heard me. I saw the two with my own eyes. I saw the paramedics take her and her son on a gurney down this very corridor. It was 3 years ago." I began to tremble in fear for my son's life. When Francesca's husband left her, she didn't take it well. She grieved day after day about it and stayed alone in her apartment with her son. She probably told you she wasn't that well off since her husband didn't support her. But hear me, her family was in no way poor. They helped her out in every way possible, but it was never enough for her. She was a bad mother. She often forgot to pick up her son from school. She didn't take care of him properly. It was probably because the boy looked like his father, the man that she despised. She went insane and started to blame her son for everything that had happened. She stopped eating and sleeping. She did nothing around the house. She looked like a mess. It was a good thing that her family cared for her and intervened. They knew she wasn't fit to raise a child and tried to get custody of the child. Of course, it enraged Francesca. She wouldn't allow anything like that to happen. Eventually, the whole family thought it was necessary to get Francesca the help she needed. They sent her to an asylum and planned to keep the child with them. But the day that she was supposed to be taken away, she locked herself and her son in the apartment and refused to come out. The next morning, the paramedics were flooded on this floor. I saw them take away Francesca and her son. A few days later, I attended their funeral. It was all very unnatural. Their physical bodies may not be here, but their souls still are. I hear them in there every night. The apartment was put on the market, but no one ever got through in purchasing it after hearing the history behind it. On the day of the funeral, I had told Francesca's father to allow me to purify the apartment, but he didn't believe in anything I said. "You asked me about your son? You left him there, in that apartment." The old man sighed and became silent. I stammered and said, But I know Francesca. She used to come to my apartment. We had tea together. Our sons played together. We're good friends." The old man patted my shoulder. "Francesca passed away a long time ago, Maria." I began to sob uncontrollably. I ran out and began pounding on Francesca's door until I fell to my knees, helpless. The old man called the police. When they arrived and opened the door, I found everything covered in a thick layer of dust inside. Spiderwebs hanged from the walls. There in the middle of the room, my son lay on the floor. I watched them carry my son out with them. I became hysterical. Everything became hazy. I remember the police questioning me. I remember my husband shaking me by my shoulders and shouting until I went unconscious. I was taken to an institution where I could get help. They kept me there for a year until they released me. My husband had divorced me before I was released. He suspected that I did something to our son. I was forced to move back with my parents. Sometimes, I hear my son calling me. I turn and see him running towards me and saying, Mommy, Mommy, don't leave me. They won't let me go." Click on the subscribe button and check out more awesome videos on our channel, because you know it's interesting.